you. Welcome, Noam Perski, to the Security Today Knowledge Summit 2020. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We've seen, as founding member of the James Edition, which is one of the most fascinating global online luxury marketplace. From there, you've gone on to Palantir Technologies, and you've been there for the last 9 years. What we see in the last few years on the global scene, a number of emerging hotspots. In the South China Sea, we see the Indo-Pacific region hotting up. We see also a rising nationalism among countries, both United States, you look at some of the countries, an aggressive China, protectionism, which is also anti-globalization to an extent. We've seen in the Iran and Saudi Arabia jostling for supremacy in the Middle East, Israel watching closely from the sidelines on Iran's nuclear ambitions. If you look at all this, and I won't mention the number of other small conflicts that are taking place, how do you see this rolling out in the coming years?
Wow. So first, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and to talk with you in particular, given your background and having been in the thick of it in one of the most interesting places in the world in the period that you were Home Secretary, and to the organizers here for giving me the opportunity to chat a little bit. I'm sitting in Stockholm, Sweden, where the sun is about to set in the early afternoon, in a what is normally a very comfortable part of the world, except for the proximity to Russia. And so sitting up here, especially this year, I usually am on the road 2-3 days a week into a lot of the places that you just described, because supporting our efforts in lots of places. Now, this particular year, I've been here since the 1st of March, just sort of watching the world unfold. So it's been a little bit strange to opine on this big picture in this oddest of times. But the question you pose is a big one. I think in addition to the broader sort of geopolitical context of the jostling of position, the pullback of the U.S. in the last couple of years and the vacuum that leaves, the impact of that on conflicts in the South China Sea, as you mentioned, for example, or leaving sort of the Middle East to work itself out a little bit, which is also interesting. I'd add that there's a level of complexity here, and that's actually what's going on within the countries themselves. So we see, not just the rise of nationalism, but the rise of the far left and the far right again. We see waves of this over the last, over many years, but really, I think this resurgence, and that is one of the things that worries me, because that internal conflict will always take precedence over the geopolitical in the minds of people. And while being distracted by that sort of internal conflict, whether it's in Europe with Brexit and the dissonance that brings, or in the US, we then leave space for these broader conflicts to actually advance. And so I guess the conflation of those two things, does kind of the rise of the internal conflict in Europe and the US, with this geopolitical jostling, does lead me to worry a little bit about what is our ability right now to actually tackle some of these issues. And we think about it this year, what will the focus on COVID and the right focus on the pandemic, what will that mean in the broader security context, as we can't imagine that people aren't advancing their positions and taking advantage, right?
Yeah, that's true. I was curious, you mentioned about the far right and the far left, but there's also the more than 20,000 jihadi websites promoting radicalization, a very large number of sites also on the extreme right. how does technology, in one sense, handle this? Is it possible for technology to be able to control this or moderate the increasing radicalization, whether it's the jihadi, the extreme left, or the extreme right?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that of course security services and those involved are really trying to get to grips with, because we have a very adaptive set of adversaries that will use any technology available and are quite adept at it, to be honest, right? I think that's what the rise of ISIS showed us, is that the amount of adaptation and creativity being applied to radicalization is really challenging. And I think in particular, what it's done is it's increased the pace of radicalization. And the increase in pace that technology has afforded, right? That people no longer have to go to certain places. They can just go on the websites, watch the YouTube videos, and some self-radicalize and then perpetrate attacks. The worry there is, are our security agencies able to keep the same type of pace? And I think we would likely all agree that right now we can't. And we are hampered by a set of things. One, we are hampered by a necessary kind of personnel problem in these agencies, where you have agencies that are built on the foundation of being good at being good at law enforcement, being good at the, but now we are being asked to be good at technology at the same time. And so when I talk to many of the heads of intelligence services around the world, what they tell me is, look, we're not that worried about the technology. We are getting better and better at bringing technology into the service, using that to tackle things. But we're really worried about our ability to bring people into our agency that can use this technology, and our ability to retrain the people that we already have. And that, I think, is really one of the seminal challenges facing the security complex at the moment.
Coming closer home, you've been the global lead advisor for Palantir Technologies. How has Palantir helped in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, and how does it deliver for both governments as well as commercial enterprises?
Sure, it's an excellent question. It would also be a good opportunity to plug the company, which I'm not going to do. I'm going to try to answer the substance, really, of sort of, what does, first of all, we are pulled into the central pandemic response in 16 countries, ranging from the NHS using our platforms to allocate personal protective equipment and oxygen and other critical goods across the country. The US Operation Warp Speed vaccine acceleration program is being run on our platforms. And then, the Greek prime minister uses our platform to understand what's happening in his country. It's just a few examples. So the big question is, why does an institution that has its roots in counterterrorism, intelligence, and law enforcement, why are we pulled into this? And I think that might be a useful lens. When we started working in this space 17 years ago in the counterterrorism space, we discovered very quickly that the key challenge here was that we had agencies that had actionable intelligence, had good analysts, but those analysts didn't have access to the right information, and the information wasn't able to be brought together. Because very rightly, many of these agencies were very careful about being able to segment and silo information, keep it safe and secure. The problem is, as the threats were evolving and adapting, it was important to be able to look across all that information in a way that was still protective of people's individual privacy and civil liberties. And so we took a very technical approach to the ability to bring together data in a world that was sort of built to keep data apart. Now, if you fast forward 17 years and you look at the COVID pandemic and what the NHS is faced with, we got the call in March on a Thursday from the Boris Johnson's lead advisors saying, hey, by Monday, we need to understand the state of the pandemic in our country. We need to know, how many hospital beds do we have? How many ICU beds do we have? How many cases do we have? How many people are we testing? All of this, which is being done by an enormous apparatus. And it turns out the challenge there was very similar to the challenge of counterterrorism. It's sort of, we have all this data that is siloed off in many systems around the country, belongs to many different institutions. It needs to be brought together in a safe and secure manner, in a manner that is auditable, so we know exactly who looked at what. It's protected, so we know exactly who has access to what. And if you can do that, you can then bring this data and start providing this interesting picture of what is actually going on in the pandemic. Once you know what's going on, you can then begin to allocate resources. And that's really where we've, our presence in the response has evolved, is sort of working with governments to now allocate scarce resources based on actual data of what's going on. Because in the past, what you did was sort of make guesses and assumptions. And the problem is now resources are too scarce and this pandemic is evolving too rapidly to make guesses. And so we're now helping governments around the world make those allocation decisions and now also prepare for the vaccine distribution project, which is going to be a Herculean task for governments across the world, given the myriad number of different vaccines, deciding who should be vaccinated first, understanding if it's working, all of these questions that really are based on, if you do it properly, can be based on data and science and actually understanding the situation on the ground. But to do that, you then apply sort of these intelligence and security principles around how do you safely and securely bring data together to give that picture to people and give those tools to people to make decisions.
Did you really see that when governments, when this type of data is put before them, because in many cases, they are themselves would be liable to be criticized in the manner in which they are handling this data or the COVID-19 epidemic itself. And therefore, is there a reluctance on the part of government to selectively release data which is possibly supporting the government rather than giving the facts transparently to the larger population?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I would say, we titled this talk "Uneven Progress." I would say that there's an unevenness in the answer to that question, where some places are very driven. What we're seeing is in the differences in the response. There are places where there's a very strong political bent to the response, and there are, which you see, in the U.S. across different states, right, where it's less about the science and more about the politics. There are other places, I think, for example, if you look at the German response or honestly the response in the UK, that really they've been trying to be led by data and science, and in that case have been quite transparent. It's very difficult, right, because the picture's evolving. And when you ask science says, well, we're not quite sure. This is brand new. And so for a politician, it's a very difficult thing to say to the people. So I would say that the response in that case is quite uneven. We've seen some attempts to use it for political ends. But we've also seen a lot of trust being built in some rather, I would say, surprising places. Greece, for example, is not the place that I would first pick to be, to say, hey, this is a place that uses, makes data-driven decisions, is transparent with the people, and does a really, really good job of this type of policymaking. But they've done a tremendous job through this epidemic, and it's really been to their advantage. I'll just give you a short example. This summer, Greece is dependent on tourism for 27% of GDP. And especially tourism from the UK to the Greek islands is existential for these places. And so keeping travel running between the UK and Greece this summer was of paramount importance. Now, what the UK was doing was kind of applying this idea that if you have less than 20 cases per 100,000 then they would keep a travel corridor open. And where they're looking at the Greek islands, they were seeing how many positive cases on the Greek islands, but then they were basically using Wikipedia to say how many people live on Mykonos, for example. But that number is from the winter. So maybe 10,000 people live in the winter and 100,000 people in the summer. And so what we were able to help the Greek government do was to say, okay, how many people are flying to the island? How many people are on ferries? How many people are leaving every day? How many people are you testing? And in that way, you're able to provide a very accurate picture of how many people are on the island and what is our number. And they were able to then share that number with the UK and then keep those travel corridors running because they were using real data and real substance and not a political idea. And so the trust of the people now on the Greek islands and their government is actually quite high because they were able to see them do this in a transparent way and actually make a good set of decisions.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. But what we have seen, and I think many participants here would also realize that we've actually been flooded with a surfeit of information from different healthcare providers, policymakers, doctors, and so on. And people really don't know what is really going on. You're getting the first wave, then you get a second wave, then you get a third wave, and somebody says vaccines are coming today, somebody says next month, somebody will say, the WHO says June 2021, and then you find that a whole series of drugs which at one point of time, I'm just giving an example of remdesivir, which everybody said was, it's the cure for those who are seriously affected. And 6 months later, the WHO comes out and says it doesn't do anything. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting talking about this in this forum, because I think, as you'll know well, and as many of the people on this call know well, they're corollaries here to working in counterterrorism, counter-radicalization, and these environments where the picture is quite murky, right? And so people in the security and intelligence space are often quite adept at making decisions with enormous uncertainty. And now what we're seeing is sort of parts of the world that there are parts of our society that aren't necessarily usually in that position. Like, how do you make good decisions in the face of enormous uncertainty? And that's sort of the question that's being asked, and the one that we're very involved in many places. What we're trying to do in most places, as we do in security and intelligence, is, okay, let's have as good of a picture of what's going on as possible. Let us at least understand what the facts are, and then what is opinion, right? And try to differentiate those two. And where we can, try to build an optionality in our decision-making process. Because if we don't know what's true and what's opinion, we will then be incredibly conservative and we'll lock everything down forever, right? It's basically exactly what we see in security. How do you make these decisions? And so what the other important part of this is, then when you want to make decisions, to be able to affect them quite quickly. So if we, for example, can quickly allocate personal protective equipment, masks or oxygen or ventilators, then what we can do is we can make efficient decisions. We don't have to try to build up giant stockpiles. We can really work with what we have. In the same way as many of the customers we work with in the defense space, and what they're realizing is, how do we do more with less people, right? How do we make decisions in this world so that we can be nimble and agile, because that is what's being asked of us in the security context and in the COVID context. Yeah, no, coming further, the more than 500 delegates who are listening to you, a very large number of them are corporate chief security officers and chief intelligence from the information sector. What would be your thoughts to them for guiding them during this particularly difficult times when security problems are arising literally on a day-to-day basis, different security problems? Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and it's a true challenge. We're seeing corporate security, institutional security being pulled into all kinds of questions now around the mobility of people, the safety of people in the COVID pandemic, but also, as you started this talk with, the complex geopolitical landscape and the rise of state-sponsored hacking and all of these different pieces. And so, if you look at the totality and say, where do I even start? But the people that we see be very successful now are the ones who are applying technology in smart ways. I think this was talked about in Rajan's panel on drones, especially here. How does one apply these new technologies in ways to actually make the picture clearer and not murkier, and not get pulled around by buzzwords around artificial intelligence and machine learning and this or that, but really, can we put technology in service of our people? And that I think is the key to the strong approaches that we've seen, where we have good people who are trained, who can make good decisions, and what they need is help sifting through data, or they need help getting a better picture of what's going on. If we can apply technology to assist those people, then we're very successful. If we try to replace those people right now with technology, I've seen a lot of failure. So I'm not saying that we can't be more efficient with technology. We can, but we can not yet trust the machine to do the work of these people. We have to apply it in service of these people's decision making. Yeah, I agree with you on that. But I think what would you really, in one sense, advise people who are here in terms of both learning as well as training to meet the challenges of these new technologies? How do they really do it and apply it back into their companies and enterprises?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in the conception of iteration, and that is the way that we've built our business over 17 years, and have moved, as I said, starting out working on counterterrorism in the U.S. to global support for the pandemic and working in heavy manufacturing with Airbus, and doing all of this set of things. It's really come through iteration, and with iteration I mean actually doing things. So rather than piloting things or putting things into non-production sort of play around environments, like let's try to solve real problems. And each time we solve that real problem, can we disseminate the knowledge in our organization? And can we learn? And the organizations that are able to do that and learn very quickly are the ones that we see winning. And that is, often the differentiation between very technical organizations and non-technical organizations isn't actually their mastery of technology. It's their willingness to try and iterate. I'm in love with the idea of SpaceX, who launches rockets and lands them. And if you asked anybody 20 years ago, can you land a rocket? No, of course you can't. It could never happen, right? The way they got there was by crashing 20 rockets, and then they land the first one, and then they crash another couple, and then now they can land them every time. And I think that spirit, and it's quite difficult in security. I have a lot of respect for that. It's quite difficult to fail in security. So it's difficult to say iterate, fail fast, all these wonderful buzzwords. But I do think there is room to iterate and learn, and really try to apply these technologies in the real world in service of even small problems. And in doing that, learn and then apply them to bigger and bigger problems. That would be my kind of concrete advice.
Are there any sort of very specific trainings or learning centers for these CSIOs to take advantage of immediately?
My favorite thing right now, honestly, is the professional groupings where CISOs and intelligence and security professionals are actually coming together. So rather than reading treatises, it's really places, whether it's LinkedIn or professional forums or provided by different institutions in different countries. I think the practical exchange of knowledge right now is the most important thing, rather than the theoretical exercise, because the theoretical exercises at this point, I think, are too slow.
How do you see, I know you mentioned that artificial intelligence is a word that's used very frequently and without great understanding. But in the security situation, especially where national security interests are concerned, could you just give us a few examples of how artificial intelligence is being used to help countries or industries?
Yeah, so I think right now the best application of artificial intelligence is very much in the defense context, I would say, rather than the pure intelligence context. And it's being used in ways where there's just information overload. Right, there's just too much for any human to actually go through in a coherent way, and so everybody's terrified of missing something. And so when we're applying AI to sort of in the triage phase, whether this is drone imagery, right? There's so many assets that are flying now that if you're trying to understand what is actually going on in the world, can we put enough eyeballs on the feeds to watch what's going on all the time? No, we can't. So can we apply artificial intelligence there? Yes, we can. It's being done successfully. There is a volume, as you refer to, of things that are happening online. Can we, out of that sort of triage in that first step, and then put it to human eyes to understand the context? So I think that's what's successful. The triage step and looking through the information. We're still too weak on AI to actually provide real context of what's actually happening. But we can flag when nothing is happening and then show what is happening to people to help contextualize. So there we're seeing tremendous progress in the understanding of text and the understanding of imagery. Again, not to make decisions, but to be able to flag to humans out of this enormous corpus of information what is happening. What is interesting is what's necessary for this to work is a strong foundation. And I believe you were part of India's very ambitious goals of creating this years ago with NatGrid and others. We need a connected infrastructure that is able to bring together information for then AI to work on top of. Without that sort of coherent data picture, it is impossible. In the corporate sense, we work with Airbus, for example. So every single Airbus plane that is flying for 150 different airlines, well, now less of them are flying, but when they land, they download all of their sensor data into one platform, and then Airbus is able to provide, based on that platform, wonderful analytics to these airlines about what might be happening and where they need to make changes or do maintenance. But without that platform where this coherent picture is happening, it is impossible to effectively apply artificial intelligence. So we are still sort of in this foundational phase. And to those that are doing this successfully, as I said, many of them in the defense context, they're taking care to build these data platforms first and then apply the artificial intelligence technology on top of it.
Noam, on a very personal note, in terms of your setting up the James edition and what you learned from that, how were you able to use some of that learning into what we call into the security aspects, which you are now doing?
Yeah, it's a curious path. My path honestly was when I was 19 years old, back in 95, 96. I was one of these internet kids, right? You remember the first wave of internet companies, and so I was involved in that. I dropped out of school and started my first startup and built that all the way up, and then it all crashed in 2000, 2001. And I went and had a nice existential crisis because all this hard work was gone. And so I ended up in Geneva working in global health for about 6 years. So HIV, TB, and malaria, working on health systems financing, frontier retrovirals, and doing really deeply impactful work. But I'm a nerd, and so I was doing nothing technical. And I ended up meeting a friend who bought and sold expensive things to buy more expensive things. Now, I don't wear a watch. I don't own a car. I could care less about expensive stuff. But it was an interesting challenge. And so I went and built this marketplace. I did wake up one day about 4 years later, realizing that, honestly, this is not what I want to be spending my time doing. I want to be doing important things that matter to the world. And honestly, if I help one more guy buy a yacht, that's not an important thing. And so I ended up at Palantir, where I have 2,500 people who are committed every day to doing really important things with their time. What I did bring with me, from that experience was that working on hard problems is fun. And working in the security space, we're not working on problems that we solve. We're working on problems that we work on. We're not going to solve counterterrorism, right? We're not going to solve corporate espionage. We're going to keep working on the problem. And that's what's fun being an entrepreneur and building a company is sort of you're never done. So maybe that's what I brought with me, plus this idea of iteration and attempts and failure being instructive.
Again, on a personal note, your TED talk on clouds was possibly one of the most brilliant talks that I've heard about on the cloud itself. How do you see the cloud as it evolved from the time when you made that talk and where it is today? And how much of social benefits is that which you started at that time in terms of the carbon footprint? Do you see that going further ahead?
Yeah, I would say that, honestly, especially in this forum, the cloud is having an incredible impact on our ability to quickly deploy technology and adapt to new problems. I would say that, one of the effects of the COVID pandemic is a 5-year acceleration of the acceptance of cloud technologies, both in the security context and non-security context. Before COVID, if I were to go talk to a central government in Europe about deploying technology into the cloud to understand the picture of what's happening in their healthcare system, they would have laughed me out the door. There is no regulation. We don't know the security. There's all these arguments. And now we have deployed, solutions. All of these solutions we talked about before for the NHS and others are deployed in the cloud with proper controls, with security, so we have this rapid acceleration. What does that mean? It means, we started working with an unnamed country 3 days ago who are now realizing in their second wave that they need to get a grip on what's going on. From 3 days ago, we agreed that we would start. On Thursday, we are deploying the first set of solutions. It's less than a week. it's impossible in a non-cloud world. So we're able to drive, operational capability for intelligence organizations. Before COVID, we could never get them to think about doing anything that wasn't disconnected from the internet and high side. And now, because they have to send half of their workforce at least home because they couldn't have this many people in the office that are idling and they're behind on investigations, we've been working with them to find ways to use open source intelligence and to do analysis on the low side in the cloud. And we've with several customers now talking about the fact that they're able to be about 70% effective working from home. I mean, if you're talking about an intelligence service, you would have asked me this, would that have been possible 5 years ago? They would have just left. And so the cloud is driving that space. It does worry me, I have a very American accent, but I live in Sweden. I'm a European. I do worry about the dominance of the large cloud players in this space because it is entirely foundational technology. And we need to be thinking smartly about how, what that means and the concentration of risk that we have in that space. But they are allowing us to do things that are entirely unprecedented.
Thank you very much, Noam. Would you just like to, before we conclude, what would you sort of, if there's any last words to the delegates here, what would you like to say to them?
I think as you were talking about at the beginning, which I think is really astute, is that the framing is, the uncertainty of the world is not decreasing. Decision making with uneven information, decision making, without having a perfect picture, is a skill set and an ability that I think people in this conference have, that is becoming increasingly valuable, and applying technology in smart ways to support those people in making that decision is going to be critical to our success. And the need we have for leaders such as yourself who understand that is the case is key and will be really the thing that determines sort of who wins, because I think, as everybody who's involved in this call knows, this is somewhat of a zero-sum game. And so, I guess those are my parting thoughts. I appreciate basically everybody who's on this call, their dedication to their work, and saying that they are more important now than ever. We'll be doing our best to support many of them in their work. And thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.